Don't move. Hands where I can see them.
Officer, am I being detained? On what grounds?
You're acting suspicious. Show me ID again.
I already did. I'm a
Believe you. Open the car now.
You have no problem.
Refuse again and you're...
Lieutenant Marcus Hayes was filling up his government vehicle at a Virginia gas station when Officer Derek Colton pulled in behind him, lights already flashing. Hayes wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any laws. He was a decorated Pentagon official in uniform, holding a Department of Defense identification card, about to become the victim of the most catastrophic case of racial profiling in recent law enforcement history. What Officer Colton didn't know was that every second of what happened next was being recorded by 3 different cameras, that the man he was about to handcuff reported directly to senior military leadership, and that his actions would trigger a federal investigation so severe it would end with him sentenced to 62 years in prison. This wasn't just another traffic stop gone wrong. This was a case that would reach the Secretary of Defense, expose a network of corrupt officers, and prove that some mistakes carry consequences beyond anything you can imagine. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes was 41 years old. He had served in the United States Army for 19 years, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge. He had risen through the ranks to become a logistics coordinator at the Pentagon, managing supply chain operations for military installations across 3 continents. He worked directly with generals. He briefed members of Congress. He held a top-secret security clearance that had required background checks so thorough they interviewed his high school teachers. On this particular Tuesday afternoon in March, Hayes was driving from the Pentagon to a military contractor facility in Alexandria, Virginia. Standard government vehicle. Navy blue Ford sedan with Department of Defense plates clearly visible. He was in his Army service uniform, the formal dress uniform with his rank insignia, ribbons, and name tape all properly displayed. You couldn't look at him and not know he was military. He pulled into a gas station off Route 1. Nothing unusual about it. He had stopped there dozens of times before. He swiped his government fuel card, started pumping gas, and checked his phone for the address of his next meeting. That's when Officer Derek Colton of the Alexandria Police Department pulled into the gas station behind him. Colton was driving a marked patrol car. His lights went on immediately, aimed at Hayes' vehicle. Hayes looked up from his phone. His training kicked in instantly. Assess the situation, identify the threat level, determine the appropriate response. He saw a police officer approaching with his hand near his weapon. Hayes put his phone in his pocket and kept his hands visible. Officer Colton was 34 years old, 8 years with the Alexandria Police Department. He had a disciplinary file that included 2 written warnings for excessive force and 1 suspension for falsifying a police report. But he was still on active duty, still carrying a badge and gun, still making traffic stops. Colton walked up to Hayes with aggressive body language. Weight forward, shoulders tight, jaw set. You need to step away from the vehicle. Hayes kept his voice calm and professional. Officer, I'm Lieutenant Marcus Hayes with the United States Army. I'm fueling a government vehicle. Is there a problem? I said step away from the vehicle. Can you tell me what this is about? Colton's hand moved to his weapon. Don't make me repeat myself. Hayes assessed the situation again. Complying seemed like the safest option, even though nothing about this made sense. He stepped away from the gas pump, hands still visible. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to follow orders even when they seemed irrational, to control his emotions in dangerous situations. I need to see some identification, Colton said. Of course. Hayes reached slowly for his wallet. I'm reaching for my military ID and driver's license. They're in my right front pocket. He pulled out his wallet and handed over both cards. His military ID had his photograph, his rank, his Department of Defense identification number. His driver's license showed the same name, same face. Colton looked at the IDs for about 5 seconds. Then, he looked at Hayes' uniform, at the ribbons on his chest, at the name tape that said Hayes, at the rank insignia that clearly showed he was a commissioned officer. Colton should have apologized. He should have realized this was a uniformed military officer fueling a government vehicle at a gas station. There was no crime, no violation, no reasonable suspicion of anything. Instead, Colton said, This vehicle was reported stolen. Hayes felt his stomach drop. Reported stolen? This is a government vehicle. The plates are registered to the Department of Defense. I have authorization to operate it. There must be some mistake. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Officer, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. I can show you my orders. I can give you the phone number for my commanding officer. This vehicle is assigned to me for official government business. I'm not going to ask again. Have you ever been accused of a crime you absolutely didn't commit? Think about that feeling for a second. Hayes made a decision. He would comply, let this get sorted out at the station, and file a complaint later. Arguing with an aggressive officer at a gas station wasn't going to end well. He turned around and placed his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, metal against skin, tight enough to restrict circulation. Hayes had been in combat zones. He had been shot at. He had seen people die. But standing in handcuffs at a gas station in Virginia while wearing his dress uniform felt more humiliating than anything he had experienced in 19 years of military service. Other customers were watching now. Some had their phones out. One woman was recording from her car about 20 feet away. A man pumping gas on the other side of the station had stopped mid-pump to stare. Colton walked Hayes to the patrol car and put him in the back seat. The plastic seat was hard and uncomfortable. The car smelled like stale fast food and the artificial pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. Hayes sat perfectly still. His mind was already working through the chain of command. Who to call first, what information to provide, how to document everything. He had dealt with complex logistical problems under pressure. This was just another problem that needed a systematic solution. Colton got in the front seat and started typing on his computer. He was running the vehicle plates, checking for wants and warrants, doing what he should have done before making the stop. The computer came back with results. The vehicle was registered to the Department of Defense. Not stolen. Not wanted. Properly registered with current tags and no flags in the system. Colton stared at the screen. Hayes could see his face in the rearview mirror. The officer's expression changed from confident to uncertain. Hayes spoke calmly from the back seat. Officer, as you can see, the vehicle is properly registered. I'm a commissioned officer in the United States Army. I have authorization to operate this vehicle. I'd appreciate it if you would contact my commanding officer to verify my identity and credentials. Colton didn't respond. He picked up his radio. Dispatch, I need you to run a military ID number. He read off the number from Hayes's military identification card. There was a pause, then dispatch came back on the radio. That ID is valid and active, registered to Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, United States Army, assigned to Pentagon Logistics Operations. Is there a problem? Colton's face went pale. No problem. Disregard. He sat there for a long moment. Hayes watched him in the mirror. The officer was realizing what he had done. He had handcuffed a Pentagon official in full uniform for absolutely no reason. What happened next would determine whether this was just an embarrassing mistake or something much worse. Colton made his choice. Instead of admitting the error, instead of apologizing and releasing Hayes immediately, instead of calling a supervisor, he decided to double down. He got out of the patrol car, opened the back door, and pulled Hayes out. You're under arrest for resisting an officer and providing false information. Hayes couldn't believe what he was hearing. False information? My credentials are valid. Your own dispatch just confirmed it. What false information did I provide? You claimed this vehicle was assigned to you. I have reason to believe that's not true. Your computer just showed it's a Department of Defense vehicle. I'm a Department of Defense employee. I have my military ID, my orders, everything you need to verify my authority. Colton grabbed Hayes by the arm and started walking him toward the patrol car again. That's when the woman who had been recording from her car got out and approached them. Excuse me, officer. I've been recording this entire interaction. This man has been cooperative. He showed you his credentials. Why are you arresting him? Ma'am, step back or you'll be arrested for interfering. I'm standing on public property recording a public official. That's my First Amendment right. Colton ignored her and put Hayes back in the patrol car. He slammed the door and drove away from the gas station. The woman was still recording. She had captured everything. The drive to the police station took 12 minutes. Colton didn't say a word. Hayes didn't either. But Hayes was thinking about something Colton hadn't considered. Every military officer has an emergency contact protocol. If Hayes didn't check in within a certain time frame, if he missed his scheduled meeting, if he failed to respond to communications, the Pentagon would start looking for him. And they were very good at finding people. The booking process at the Riverside Police Department started at 3:47 p.m. Hayes was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. His personal belongings were confiscated, including his phone. That phone contained classified Pentagon communications. Taking it was a federal crime in itself. Hayes sat in the cell and waited. He knew exactly what would happen. His commanding officer at the Pentagon expected a check-in call at 4 p.m. When that call didn't come, protocol would activate. The military doesn't mess around when officers go missing. At 4:03 p.m., Major General Patricia Reeves tried calling Hayes. No answer. She tried again at 4:05. Still nothing. At 4:07, she activated emergency protocols. Within minutes, military police were tracking Hayes' last known location using the GPS in his government vehicle. They found the SUV still parked at the gas station. Security footage showed a police officer arresting Hayes and driving away. The military police called the Riverside Police Department at 4:22 p.m. They asked if Hayes was in custody. The desk sergeant checked the system and confirmed an arrest had been made. "What's the charge?" the military officer asked. "Resisting arrest and providing false information." There was a pause on the military side. Then the officer said something that made the desk sergeant's blood run cold. "You've detained a Pentagon official with top-secret clearance. His credentials are valid. His vehicle authorization is legitimate. You need to release him immediately and contact the Department of Defense Inspector General." The desk sergeant hung up and walked directly to the watch commander's office. Captain Robert Thornton had been with Riverside PD for 18 years. He listened to the desk sergeant explain the situation. Then, he pulled up Hayes' arrest report. Thornton read it twice. He looked at the military ID that had been confiscated. He looked at the vehicle registration. Everything was legitimate. Everything checked out. An officer had arrested a Pentagon official for no reason. "Where's Colton now?" Thornton asked. "Finishing his paperwork. Get him in here." Now, Officer Daniel Colton walked into the watch commander's office expecting a routine debrief. Instead, he found Captain Thornton standing with his arms crossed and an expression that could melt steel. "Explain this arrest." Colton went through his version of events. Suspicious vehicle, uncooperative suspect, false credentials. He made it sound reasonable. He made it sound justified. Thornton didn't buy it. "I've seen the gas station security footage. The suspect was cooperative. He provided valid credentials. You had no legal basis for this arrest. And now we have the Department of Defense calling us demanding his release." Colton's face went pale. "The credentials were suspicious. They were verified by our own dispatch. They were verified by the military. You arrested a Pentagon official because you didn't like that a black man was driving a nice vehicle. That's not true. I had reasonable suspicion. Of what? Driving while black? You've just created a federal incident." At 4:51 p.m., Lieutenant Marcus Hayes was released from custody. All charges were dropped. His belongings were returned, including his phone. Captain Thornton personally apologized and offered to drive Hayes back to his vehicle. Hayes declined. "I'll arrange my own transportation, but I need to make a call." The call went to Major General Reeves. Hayes explained everything. The stop, the arrest, the confiscated phone with classified materials. Reeves listened without interrupting. When Hayes finished, she said 3 words that would change everything. "I'll handle it." Within 2 hours, federal investigators from the Department of Defense Inspector General arrived at the Riverside Police Department. They requested all records related to Hayes' arrest. Body camera footage, dash cam footage, audio recordings, written reports, everything. They also requested Officer Colton's complete personnel file. Every arrest he'd made in 5 years, every traffic stop, every use of force report. They were looking for patterns. They found them immediately. Over the previous 3 years, Colton had stopped black motorists at a rate 4 times higher than white motorists. His search rates showed similar disparities. His arrest rates were off the charts compared to other officers in the department. But the investigators found something worse. They found evidence that Colton had been falsifying arrest reports. He would claim suspects were uncooperative when body camera footage showed compliance. He would claim he smelled marijuana when searches turned up nothing. He would claim furtive movements that never happened. The pattern was clear and documented. Colton had been systematically targeting minorities and lying in his reports to justify unconstitutional stops and arrests. He had been doing it for years. Nobody had caught it because nobody had looked at the data comprehensively. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a criminal investigation, not just into Colton, but into whether the Riverside Police Department had enabled his behavior through inadequate supervision. Colton was placed on administrative leave. He hired an attorney. The attorney reviewed the evidence and told him the truth. You're going to prison. The federal charges came down 6 weeks later. Deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, falsifying government records, obstruction of justice. 18 counts total, each carrying potential prison time. But prosecutors kept digging. They found something that elevated everything to another level. They found that Colton had been selling information from the police database. Names, addresses, criminal histories. He had been selling it to private investigators, bail bondsmen, and people looking to harass their enemies. That added federal computer crimes charges, unauthorized access to government systems, wire fraud, conspiracy. The indictment grew to 37 counts. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented body camera footage from dozens of stops. They showed the jury how Colton would change his story between what happened on camera and what he wrote in reports. They demonstrated the statistical patterns in his stops and arrests. They brought in victims, people Colton had arrested on false charges, people who had lost jobs because of bogus arrests, people who had been humiliated and violated by an officer abusing his authority. Lieutenant Hayes testified for 2 days. He walked the jury through every moment of his arrest. He explained military protocols, Pentagon security requirements, the sensitivity of the materials that had been confiscated. He made it clear this wasn't just misconduct, it was a national security breach. The defense tried to argue Colton was following his training. They tried to claim he had reasonable suspicion. They tried to paint him as a dedicated officer who made mistakes. The jury didn't believe it. They saw the patterns. They saw the falsified reports. They saw an officer who had turned his badge into a weapon against people he was supposed to protect. The verdict came back guilty on all 37 counts. Sentencing happened 8 weeks later. Federal guidelines recommended 20 to 30 years, but the judge considered additional factors: the abuse of authority, the targeting of minorities, the falsified records, the sale of confidential information, the national security implications of detaining a Pentagon official and confiscating classified materials. Judge Maria Santos delivered the sentence with no hesitation: 62 years in federal prison, no parole. Colton would be 79 years old before he'd be eligible for release. The courtroom was silent. Colton's attorney closed his eyes. Colton himself showed no emotion. He had known this was coming. The evidence was overwhelming. Hayes attended the sentencing. He sat in the gallery and watched justice delivered. Afterward, reporters asked him how he felt. His answer was measured and precise. This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. Officer Colton violated the rights of dozens of people. He abused his authority systematically. The sentence reflects the severity of his crimes and sends a message that this behavior won't be tolerated. But Hayes wasn't finished. He filed a civil lawsuit against the Riverside Police Department. The lawsuit alleged systematic failures in supervision, inadequate training, failure to investigate patterns of misconduct, and deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. The city fought it initially. They claimed they had proper oversight. They claimed Colton was a rogue officer who had hidden his behavior. They claimed they couldn't have known. Hayes' attorneys destroyed those arguments with the department's own data. They showed that supervisors had access to every stop report Colton filed. They showed that his arrest rates for minorities were flagged by the system multiple times. They showed that complaints had been filed and dismissed without proper investigation. They showed that Colton's partner rotations were unusually frequent, suggesting other officers didn't want to work with him. The pattern wasn't hidden, it was ignored. The city's defense collapsed under scrutiny. Internal emails revealed supervisors had discussed Colton's statistics but decided not to intervene because his arrest numbers made the department look productive. Making arrests meant securing federal grants. It meant justifying budget increases. Nobody wanted to look too closely at whether those arrests were legitimate. Hayes's lawsuit also revealed something else. The Pentagon had gotten involved after his detention, not publicly, not dramatically, but definitively. Within 72 hours of Hayes's arrest, 2 Defense Department attorneys had contacted the Riverside Police Department demanding every document related to the incident. They wanted body camera footage, dash cam recordings, arrest reports, evidence logs, chain of custody documentation for the confiscated materials. Everything. The Pentagon attorneys had made something clear to city officials. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had been transporting materials related to active naval operations. The detention had created a gap in the security chain. Classified documents had been handled by unauthorized personnel. That was a federal security breach with implications beyond local police misconduct. The city had tried to minimize it. They claimed the materials were secured properly, that nothing was compromised, that protocols were followed. The Pentagon disagreed. They conducted their own investigation. They found that evidence room security was inadequate. They found that the chain of custody documentation was incomplete. They found that Colton had accessed the confiscated materials multiple times without proper authorization or supervision. What the Pentagon found in their audit made everything worse. Colton had photographed some of the documents with his personal phone. Not all of them, but enough. Classified briefing materials with operational details. He claimed he was documenting evidence. The Pentagon called it espionage. That's when additional federal charges materialized. Unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Mishandling of national defense materials. The FBI Counterintelligence Division got involved. They examined Colton's phone, his computer, his financial records. They wanted to know if he had shared those photographs with anyone, if he had been paid, if there was a larger conspiracy. They found no evidence of espionage in the traditional sense. Colton hadn't sold the information to foreign governments. He hadn't shared it with adversaries. He had just been reckless and stupid, photographing classified materials because he thought it made him look important. But under federal law, intent didn't matter for some charges. Unauthorized possession of classified materials was enough. Those additional charges added 15 years to his sentence. The 62-year total reflected everything. The false arrests, the falsified reports, the database breaches, the sale of confidential information, the mishandling of classified materials. It was a comprehensive accounting of a career built on abuse. Hayes's civil lawsuit proceeded separately. The city offered to settle early. They proposed $200,000 in policy reforms. Hayes rejected it. He wanted transparency. He wanted a public trial that would expose everything. He wanted the community to see exactly how the department had failed. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Hayes's attorneys presented data showing that over Colton's 9-year career, he had made over 400 stops where the justification was questionable. They showed that 73 people had been arrested on charges that were later dismissed. They showed that complaints against Colton had been filed 18 times, and all 18 had been marked as unfounded or unsubstantiated without serious investigation. They brought in experts on police practices who testified that the warning signs were obvious. They brought in civil rights attorneys who explained how systematic failures in oversight create environments where abuse flourishes. They brought in former police chiefs from other departments who said they would have intervened years earlier if they had seen Colton's patterns. The city's defense was weak. They claimed reforms had already been implemented. They claimed Colton was an anomaly. They claimed they couldn't have predicted his behavior. The jury didn't accept it. The verdict came back in Hayes's favor. The jury awarded him $1.2 million in compensatory damages and $4.7 million in punitive damages, nearly $6 million total. The punitive damages were specifically designed to punish the department for deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. But Hayes did something unexpected with the money. He kept enough to cover his legal expenses and compensation for time lost. The rest, over $5 million, he donated. $2 million went to legal aid organizations that help people fight wrongful arrests. $2 million went to community organizations working on police accountability. $1 million went to establishing a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in law and criminal justice. Hayes gave one interview after the verdict. He was asked why he donated the money instead of keeping it. His answer was direct. This was never about personal gain. This was about changing a system that allows officers like Colton to abuse their authority for years without consequence. Money in my bank account doesn't accomplish that. Money supporting organizations that fight for accountability does. The Riverside Police Department entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice. The reforms were extensive: independent oversight board with subpoena power, mandatory early intervention system for officers showing problematic patterns, body cameras required for all uniformed officers with footage stored independently, regular audits of stop data by race and ethnicity, revised use of force policies, de-escalation training, community input in policy development. The consent decree would remain in effect for 5 years with federal monitoring. The city would spend over $12 million implementing the reforms. Critics said it was expensive. Advocates said it was necessary. Colton's case became required study material at police academies, not just in California, but nationally. The FBI used it in training for civil rights investigations. The Department of Justice cited it in pattern or practice investigations of other departments. It became shorthand for how abuse of authority combined with systematic oversight failures creates civil rights disasters. Hayes returned to his work at the Pentagon. He received a commendation for his handling of the situation. His superiors praised his restraint, his documentation, his commitment to using proper channels for accountability. He was promoted to commander 18 months later. But the impact of that traffic stop never fully disappeared. Hayes has said in private conversations that the experience changed how he views the relationship between military service and civilian life. He had spent years defending the country, following orders, maintaining discipline. Then a local police officer with a badge and a pattern of abuse had treated him like a criminal, compromised classified materials, and faced no immediate consequences until everything was documented and exposed. The case also affected how Hayes approaches leadership. He teaches younger officers about documentation, about knowing their rights, about the importance of staying calm when authority is abused. He tells them the story not to create fear of police, but to emphasize that accountability requires evidence, persistence, and willingness to fight through proper channels. Colton is currently serving his sentence at a federal correctional institution. He'll be 79 years old before he's eligible for release. His appeals have all been denied. His attorney filed a motion for sentence reduction based on good behavior. The judge denied it, noting that the severity of the crimes and the systematic nature of the abuse warranted the full sentence. Lieutenant Commander David Hayes continues his career in naval intelligence. He's now stationed at the Pentagon permanently, working on classified projects that he still can't discuss. He drives the same car. He follows the same traffic laws. And if he's ever pulled over again, he knows exactly what to do. Stay calm, document everything, assert his rights clearly, and trust that accountability is possible when evidence is preserved and the system is forced to work correctly. The security footage from that traffic stop has been viewed over 40 million times now. It's become one of those defining videos that people reference when discussing police accountability. You can watch the entire encounter yourself. Every second of Colton standing there demanding access to classified materials. Every moment of Hayes calmly refusing. Every threat Colton made. Every violation he committed. But what most people don't see in the comments and discussions is what happened behind the scenes at the Pentagon, when they learned one of their officers had been detained and his classified materials compromised by a local police officer. The Pentagon doesn't operate like civilian institutions. When national security is potentially compromised, the response is immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of Hayes' initial report, a team from the Defense Department's Office of Inspector General was reviewing every detail of the incident. They weren't just looking at what Colton did. They were assessing whether classified information had been exposed, whether proper protocols had been followed, whether the incident represented a broader security vulnerability. What they found was alarming. Colton had photographed documents marked with classification headers. Those photos were stored on his phone, a device connected to the internet, a device that backed up to cloud storage, a device that could have been hacked or accessed by foreign intelligence services. The potential damage wasn't theoretical. It was real and immediate. The Pentagon's assessment concluded that Colton's actions constituted a direct threat to national security. That assessment changed everything. This wasn't just a civil rights case anymore. It wasn't just police misconduct. It was a federal matter involving the compromise of classified national defense information. The Department of Defense referred the case to the Department of Justice with a recommendation for prosecution under federal statutes related to unauthorized access to classified materials. The DOJ assigned prosecutors from their National Security Division, the same division that handles espionage cases and terrorism prosecutions. Suddenly, Colton was facing federal charges that carried sentences measured in decades, not years. Unauthorized access to classified information, attempted theft of government property, obstruction of a military officer in performance of duty. Each charge carried mandatory minimum sentences. Each charge was backed by video evidence so clear that defense attorneys told Colton he had no chance at trial. The federal charges were filed 3 months after the initial traffic stop. Colton was arrested at his home by FBI agents. His computers, phones, and storage devices were seized. Forensic analysis confirmed that the photos of Hayes' classified documents had been stored on Colton's phone, backed up to his cloud account, and potentially accessible to anyone who might have compromised his accounts. The federal prosecutor's opening statement at trial was devastating. She played the dashcam footage showing Colton demanding access to the trunk. She showed the photos Colton had taken. She brought in Navy intelligence officers who testified about the sensitivity of the materials Hayes had been transporting. She demonstrated how Colton's actions had created a security vulnerability that required the Navy to change protocols, reassess material handling procedures, and investigate whether any information had been compromised by foreign intelligence services. The defense tried to argue that Colton didn't know the materials were classified, that he was just doing his job as a police officer, that he had no intent to compromise national security. The prosecutor destroyed that argument by showing the video again. The documents were clearly marked. Hayes had explicitly told Colton they were classified. Colton had demanded access anyway. Intent was established beyond any doubt. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Colton guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later. The federal guidelines recommended 40 to 50 years based on the charges in Colton's criminal history, but the prosecutor asked for more. She argued that Colton's systematic abuse of authority, his pattern of targeting people of color, his willingness to compromise national security to assert dominance, all of it justified an upward departure from the guidelines. The judge agreed. She sentenced Colton to 62 years in federal prison. No parole, no early release. Federal time means serving at least 85% of the sentence. Colton would be 94 years old before he walked free. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was announced. Colton's attorney looked stunned. Even the prosecutor seemed surprised by the severity, but the judge's reasoning was clear. She said Colton had violated every principle of law enforcement. He had abused his authority systematically. He had targeted vulnerable people. He had compromised national security. And he had shown no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, no acceptance of responsibility. Hayes attended the sentencing. He sat in the gallery wearing his uniform. He didn't testify. He didn't need to. His documentation had done all the work. When the sentence was announced, Hayes showed no reaction. He simply stood, nodded to the judge, and left the courtroom. The case set precedents that are still being cited. It established that local police officers who interfere with military personnel carrying classified materials can face federal prosecution. It clarified that compromising national security during a traffic stop isn't protected by qualified immunity. It demonstrated that systematic patterns of abuse can justify upward departures from sentencing guidelines even in federal cases. Legal scholars have written about the case extensively. Some argue the sentence was too harsh, that 62 years for a traffic stop gone wrong is disproportionate. Others argue it was appropriate given the systematic nature of Colton's abuse and the national security implications. The debate continues in law reviews and criminal justice publications. But for the people Colton had targeted over the years, the sentence represented something simpler: accountability, justice. Proof that even officers who abuse their authority for decades can eventually face consequences when someone with resources and knowledge fights back properly. The Riverside Police Department's reforms are still in effect. The Oversight Board has investigated 43 officers in the 5 years since its creation. 12 have been terminated. The department's stop data shows declining racial disparities, though they haven't been eliminated. Community trust remains damaged, but is slowly improving. Hayes continues his work at the Pentagon. He's spoken publicly about the incident only twice, both times at military leadership conferences where he discussed documentation and knowing your rights. He doesn't dwell on what happened. He views it as an obstacle he overcame through discipline, preparation, and commitment to proper procedures. The classified materials Hayes was transporting that day were never compromised beyond Colton's initial photographs. The Navy changed its transport protocols to prevent similar situations. Military personnel now receive specific training on how to handle law enforcement encounters when carrying classified materials. Hayes helped develop that training. Colton's 62-year sentence stands. His appeals have been exhausted. He's currently incarcerated at a federal facility where he'll remain for the rest of his natural life. The other officers involved in the cover-up are serving their sentences at various institutions. None have been released. The case proved something crucial about accountability. It takes documentation, knowledge, resources, and persistence. Hayes had all of those. Most people don't. That's why systematic reform matters. That's why oversight boards and body cameras and data analysis and independent investigations are necessary. Because most people who get pulled over by someone like Colton don't have classified materials. They don't have Pentagon backing. They don't have the knowledge or resources to fight back through every available channel. Hayes's case worked because he documented everything, stayed calm, knew his rights, and had institutions that backed him when abuse was proven. The system worked in his case. The question is whether it works for everyone else. The reforms in Riverside are trying to answer that question. The data will show over time whether accountability can become systematic rather than exceptional. The reality is stark. Hayes won because he had every advantage: military rank, Pentagon backing, federal credentials, knowledge of his rights, the ability to stay calm under extreme pressure. Most people pulled over don't have those advantages. They have fear, they have uncertainty, they have the knowledge that arguing with police can escalate into violence or death. That's what makes systematic reform essential. Body cameras can't just exist. They need to be mandatory, always on, with footage stored independently. Oversight boards can't just meet quarterly. They need subpoena power, independent funding, and authority to terminate officers who abuse their power. Data analysis can't be optional. Every stop, every search, every arrest needs to be tracked by race and reviewed for patterns. The Riverside reforms are working, slowly, imperfectly, but measurably. Stop disparities have decreased by 37% since the consent decree was implemented. Use of force incidents are down 42%. Community complaints are being investigated properly. Officers with problematic patterns are being identified early and either retrained or removed. Hayes's case became a blueprint. Other departments facing DOJ investigations point to Riverside as evidence that reform is possible. Civil rights attorneys cite the case when arguing for systematic changes rather than individual remedies. The video footage is shown in police academies as a warning about what happens when officers prioritize ego over law. Colton's 62-year sentence sends a message: abuse your authority systematically, target people based on race, compromise national security to assert dominance, and the consequences will be severe. Not a slap on the wrist, not paid administrative leave, not a transfer to another department. Prison, federal prison, for the rest of your life. The Pentagon's involvement was decisive. Without their immediate response, without their security assessment, without their referral to DOJ with national security implications, Colton might have faced local charges that could have been plea bargained down to a few years. Instead, he faced federal prosecutors with unlimited resources and charges that carried mandatory minimums measured in decades. Hayes still works at the Pentagon, still serves his country, still drives government vehicles. The difference now is that every military officer knows the protocols for handling law enforcement encounters with classified materials. They know their rights. They know what documentation to preserve. They know that the institution will back them when abuse occurs. That institutional backing matters. It's the difference between an individual fighting alone and an individual supported by systems designed to protect constitutional rights. Most civilians don't have that backing. That's why civilian oversight boards matter. That's why independent prosecutors matter. That's why data-driven accountability systems matter. Colton will die in prison. That's not speculation. At 94 years old, after serving 85% of his sentence, his release would be theoretical at best. The severity of the sentence reflects the severity of his crimes. Systematic abuse over 9 years, hundreds of unconstitutional stops, dozens of false arrests, falsified reports, database breaches, sale of confidential information, compromise of classified materials, no remorse, no accountability, just abuse, compounded by more abuse. The $5 million Hayes donated is funding change right now. Legal aid organizations are helping people fight wrongful arrests. Community organizations are training people on their rights. Scholarships are sending students to law school who will become the next generation of civil rights attorneys. The money isn't sitting in an account, it's working. Hayes made a choice. He could have kept the money. He earned it. The jury awarded it. Nobody would have questioned his decision to use it for his family, his retirement, his future. Instead, he turned a personal victory into systematic investment in accountability. That choice matters as much as the verdict. The case proves that accountability is possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible when evidence is preserved, rights are asserted, institutions respond appropriately, and people with resources choose to fight rather than accept settlements and move on quietly. Hayes fought. The Pentagon backed him. The DOJ prosecuted aggressively. The jury held Colton accountable. The judge sentenced appropriately. The system worked. The question is whether the system works for everyone. Whether the reforms stick. Whether oversight boards maintain their independence. Whether data analysis continues. Whether body cameras stay mandatory. Whether departments learn from Riverside or wait for their own federal investigations. Whether accountability becomes normal rather than exceptional. Those answers will take years to determine. But Hayes' case shows what's possible when someone refuses to accept abuse, documents everything, and fights through every available channel until justice is delivered. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.